It is often assumed that the treatment of prisoners of war during the Second World War followed clear rules that were either obeyed or ignored wholesale, depending on the nation holding them. This belief suggests a rigid system, one in which policy determined fate and individual circumstances mattered very little. The historical record, however, points to a more uneven reality, especially when prisoners fell outside the categories that military bureaucracies were designed to manage. One such case can be seen in a wartime medical file, modest in appearance and administrative in tone, that quietly altered how a single female prisoner of war was handled inside a camp system not originally built for her presence. By the early 1940s, most belligerent nations had formalized their approach to prisoners of war under international conventions that dated back to the interwar period. These agreements defined rations, labor expectations, correspondence rights, and medical care, but they were written with a specific image in mind: the able-bodied male soldier. Women captured during military operations, especially those not formally enlisted as combat troops, existed in a gray area. They were few in number, scattered across theaters of war, and often processed through systems that lacked precise instructions for their detention. According to contemporary records, one such woman was taken into custody during the later years of the conflict, after a military collapse in a contested region of Europe. She was not a civilian swept up in mass reprisals, nor was she a frontline combatant. Camp documentation identifies her primarily by age, nationality, and medical status, listing her among prisoners of war rather than civilian internees. This classification alone was unusual. It placed her under regulations that administrators themselves were still interpreting as the war evolved. When she arrived at the camp, the intake process followed standard procedure. Her belongings were cataloged, her physical condition briefly assessed, and her identity entered into a registry already overcrowded with thousands of names. Witnesses later recalled that female prisoners were often processed quickly, not out of efficiency, but because staff lacked clear guidance. Housing arrangements, labor assignments, and even uniform issuance raised questions that clerks and guards were unprepared to answer. In such situations, improvisation became policy. Medical inspections were among the few areas where the system insisted on consistency. Camp doctors, usually military officers with limited supplies, were required to record visible illnesses, injuries, and conditions that might affect labor capacity. These medical files were standardized forms, stamped, dated, and filed away. Most were routine, documenting malnutrition, respiratory infections, or untreated wounds. The file in question initially appeared no different. According to camp medical reports, the woman presented with symptoms that were not immediately life-threatening, but were persistent enough to be noted. She suffered from recurring weakness, episodes of faintness, and complications related to long-term nutritional deficiency. Such findings were common among prisoners by that stage of the war, when supply lines were strained and rations increasingly inadequate. What distinguished her case was not the diagnosis itself, but the context in which it was recorded. Medical officers were required to certify whether a prisoner was fit for labor, temporarily unfit, or permanently exempt. Labor was central to the POW system. Camps functioned as reservoirs of manpower, supplying farms, factories, and infrastructure projects. Female prisoners, when they existed at all, were often assigned to lighter duties or segregated work details. In this instance, the doctor marked the woman as unfit for assigned labor, citing a combination of physical condition and administrative unsuitability, a vague term that appeared infrequently in records. This phrasing triggered a chain of correspondence. Within the camp administration, copies of the medical file were forwarded to senior officers responsible for prisoner classification. According to later archival notes, officials debated whether her condition justified transfer to a medical facility or reclassification under civilian internment rules. The absence of explicit policy forced administrators to rely on precedent, and precedent was thin. Records suggest that the medical file was reviewed more than once over the following weeks. Each review added marginal notes rather than new diagnoses. The emphasis shifted from treatment to management. How should this prisoner be housed? Could she be included in work detachments without violating medical guidance? Was her presence among male POWs creating administrative complications? These were not humanitarian questions in the modern sense, but logistical ones, framed within a system under pressure. During this period, the woman remained in the camp infirmary longer than most prisoners with comparable conditions. Witnesses later recalled that extended infirmary stays were rare, as beds were needed for acute cases. Yet camp logs indicate that she was kept under observation, her diet marginally adjusted, her workload suspended. There is no evidence of special sympathy from staff, nor of dramatic intervention. Instead, the medical file functioned as a bureaucratic buffer, slowing decisions that might otherwise have been automatic. The broader context of wartime, medical administration helps explain this outcome. Military doctors occupied an ambiguous position. They were officers bound by orders, but they were also professionals trained to document conditions accurately. Their reports carried authority precisely because they were technical rather than emotional. A medical notation could halt a labor transfer, delay punishment, or prompt re-evaluation without openly challenging command decisions that, in camps across Europe and Asia. Similar files occasionally altered individual trajectories, though rarely in visible ways. The woman's case stands out because her gender intersected with medical categorization. Contemporary accounts indicate that female POWs were often treated as anomalies, prompting administrators to err on the side of caution to avoid violations that might later attract scrutiny. Medical documentation provided a neutral justification for such caution. It would be misleading to suggest that this file transformed the camp's treatment of women broadly. The system remained harsh, overcrowded, and indifferent to individual comfort. Malnutrition persisted, sanitation was poor, and disease spread easily. The woman continued to experience the same structural deprivation as other prisoners. What changed was the framework through which her presence was managed. According to camp correspondence, her labor exemption remained in place for several months. She was reassigned to clerical or domestic tasks within controlled areas of the camp, tasks that required less physical exertion and allowed closer supervision. These adjustments were not recorded as concessions, but as compliance with medical guidance. The language of the documents remained clinical and restrained. Witnesses later recalled that she spoke little and drew little attention. This is consistent with accounts of prisoners who learned that visibility could invite trouble. Her experience, as far as records indicate, was defined by waiting for decisions, waiting for reviews, waiting for transfers that were discussed but never finalized. The medical file remained active, periodically updated with brief notes confirming that her condition was unchanged. As the war progressed and the camp system grew more strained, administrative priorities shifted. Evacuations, shortages, and increased scrutiny from neutral observers forced camp commanders to justify deviations from standard practice. In this environment, documentation became a form of protection for the institution as much as for the individual. The woman's file provided written evidence that her treatment followed recorded assessments, reducing the risk of later accusations of misconduct. Historians examining such cases must be cautious not to impose retrospective meaning where the actors themselves perceived routine procedure. There's no indication that camp officials viewed this medical file as exceptional. It did not inspire policy reform or circulate beyond the immediate chain of command. Its influence was limited, local, and contingent. Yet its significance lies precisely in this modest scope. It demonstrates how, within a rigid and often brutal system, small administrative mechanisms could produce uneven outcomes. The treatment of prisoners was not solely the product of ideology or cruelty, but also of paperwork, categories, and professional norms. A single form, accurately completed and repeatedly referenced, could alter daily realities without altering the system's fundamental nature. As the conflict neared its end, camp records became increasingly fragmented. Transfers accelerated, files were lost or destroyed, and medical oversight deteriorated. The woman's file, however, appears to have survived intact, likely because it was stored with infirmary records rather than general registries. It ends without commentary, noting only that she remained under medical classification at the time of camp evacuation. What happened to her afterward is beyond the scope of the surviving documentation, and historians cannot responsibly speculate. The value of the file lies not in tracing an individual destiny, but in illuminating how wartime institutions functioned in practice. It shows that policy was mediated through human judgment, and that even impersonal systems contain points of friction where outcomes could shift. The Second World War is often remembered through grand narratives of strategy, ideology, and mass suffering. Within those narratives, individual cases risk being reduced to symbols or anecdotes. This medical file resists such simplification. It does not tell a story of rescue or redemption. Instead, it reveals a quieter truth, that the machinery of war was sustained by countless small decisions, many of them recorded in unremarkable language by people trying to manage unprecedented circumstances. In examining this document, historians are reminded that the past is not only shaped by dramatic events, but also by routine actions, carried out within constrained roles. A doctor filling out a form, an officer reviewing a note, a clerk filing a report, each acted within limits, yet their combined actions shaped lived experience. For one female prisoner of war, this meant a treatment that diverged slightly from the norm, not because of compassion alone, but because a medical file made deviation administratively defensible. Such cases challenge the assumption that wartime systems were uniformly applied. They show how exceptions emerged, not as acts of defiance, but as byproducts of bureaucratic complexity. In that sense, the medical file did not change the war, nor did it transform the camp. It changed how one person was classified, observed, and managed, and in doing so, it offers historians a clearer view of how power, policy, and human judgment intersected during one of the 20th century's most devastating conflicts.